There's ways that we classify studies. The first and probably the most common that you're familiar with is whether or not they're observational or interventional. And this just means that observational studies, as the name suggests, is that there is no intervention applied to the subjects you're studying. We're just observing them. It's a little bit artificial because the act of observing can change how people behave. But in theory, it's purely observational. Clinical trials are the classic interventional study. There is another type that I'll come to in a minute or later on, but you're probably aware that clinical trials are the archetypal. The other way we could classify the study designs is whether or not they're descriptive or analytical. What does that mean? It pertains to the type of question you're asking. Descriptive studies are answering a question that is quite superficial in nature or unidimensional. It's describing a problem, whereas analytical gets into cause and effect. So a descriptive study seeks to understand how common COVID is, for example, whereas an analytical study seeks to understand what are the risk factors for COVID. Does that make sense, guys? So as Josh said, there's a hierarchy of study designs that we go through that by and large give you a higher and higher sense or larger and larger kind of sense of evidence or strength of evidence, if you like. And we do consider case series and case reports to be studies, but they're not really. You know, it's incidental, you report on something that you've noticed is interesting, you can publish it, it's good, but it's not really a study as such, even though we do include it. Ecological studies are those that rely on population data. You don't actually recruit subjects into ecological studies individually. You just collect population data. So you compare infant mortality between Australia and other countries in Asia, for example. That's an ecological study. A cross-sectional study I'll talk about because I've highlighted the ones that you guys starting relatively early in your research careers will actually be more exposed to or have more opportunities to undertake. And then I will talk about case control and cohort studies. I'm not talking about clinical trials, not because they're not important, they're critically important, but I think for a beginner's class that it's not a type study design without a lot of help that you'll actually undertake. So it's not something you're naturally going to drive yourself, at least early on in your career. The other way that we can look at classifying study designs is whether or not they're longitudinal. And longitudinal studies follow subjects over time, whereas non-longitudinal studies do not. Why is it important that we make that distinction between studies that are longitudinal and those that are not? Albert, why are longitudinal studies important, especially for analytical questions?
Well, yeah. So we have that time to obviously see, because let's say you have a medication, right, and you put it to the market, you don't have a long understanding of what's going to happen down the line, it might be risk, for example.
Sure. I'm sorry, Albert, I shouldn't have picked on you. I just saw you and I remembered your name. Longitudinal studies. The most important factor of relationships between exposure and outcome is temporality. You might remember that. Causality is based on many criteria, the first of which is temporality. That is, one precedes the other. And with longitudinal studies, we have a preservation of this first criterion of causality, which is temporality or time relationships. Is that okay? So, there are other study types, systematic reviews with or without meta-analyses. You can undertake them. It would require you to upskill a fair bit, but certainly open to you guys to undertake. As Josh said, they sit right at the top of the evidence tree, by and large, in terms of evidence for causality. I will talk about validation studies. These are the ones that assess accuracy of diagnostic tests. They're qualitative studies which don't collect data other than in a very unstructured format for opinions, etc. And then there are other study designs that are way beyond an intro lecture like this one.